Hello and welcome to the Risen Jesus podcast with Dr. Mike Licona. Dr. Licona is Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University, and he's a frequent speaker on university campuses, churches, retreats, and has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. Mike is the president of Risen Jesus, a nonprofit organization. My name is Kurt Jarris, your host. On today's program, we continue our discussion on the non-canonical Christian literature. But before we continue that conversation, I want to remind you to subscribe to the program. Whether you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to Dr. Licona's channel, or the podcast on a podcast app such as Apple Podcasts or through the Google Play Store. Be sure to subscribe so you can get notifications on when new episodes are released. Well, Mike, last week we discussed two of the non-canonical Christian literature, and I put air quotes because I understand your project was a little different, historical, not so theological in terms of the methods there. But for me as a theologian, I think more having this realm of orthodoxy, and at any rate, so we talked about the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter. And there are a number of other New Testament apocryphal works that just didn't take focus here with your purposes. But the next one that you looked at was the Gospel of Judas. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Gospel of Judas and why it's caught some attention.
Well, the Gospel of Judas became a news item in 2006 when National Geographic featured it in a documentary series and produced a book on it. The manuscript of the Gospel of Judas was discovered in Egypt in the 1970s. The guy who discovered it tried to sell it and was unsuccessful at doing it at that time. So he just put it in a safe deposit box, and where it remained for about 30 years, perhaps even longer. The manuscript is dated to around the year 300. The Gospel of Judas was originally written, scholars think, around the mid-2nd century. And the reason is Irenaeus, who writes somewhere between the years 174 and 189. Irenaeus mentions a Gospel of Judas and said that it was the product of a group called the Cainites, not Canaanites, but the Cainites. And what the Cainites did was to make heroes out of biblical villains. So Judas being one of those. So the Gospel of Judas presents, it's Gnostic literature because it presents the names of 5 Gnostic figures in it. And in it, Jesus gives Judas secret knowledge that he gives to no one else. And of course, that sounds very Gnostic in nature. We have resurrection presented there as disembodied post-mortem existence. So I don't know of anyone who, not even rather skeptical scholars, who would say that the Gospel of Judas has really anything to offer us about the historical Jesus or the historical Judas. So I just said it's unlikely to give us anything for our project related to the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, it doesn't seem historical in any way, and in terms of its intent, or if it were, it's extremely revisionistic, and it's sort of intriguing that humans have this, for whatever reason, it still catches their attention. Oh, this is the true story of what really happened. Humans sort of have that way about them. I can think here of the Disney film Maleficent, where the villain of the Sleeping Beauty story they make into, they give her a backstory, and all of a sudden you become sympathetic to the cause of the villain. So you almost feel bad or sad for them as you see them become the villain. So they might not make them out to be the hero, but all of a sudden their evil is explained or understandable. So it's interesting that humans have that about them, that we want to know these things. So you see that with the Cainites, like you said, making these villains out to be the good guys.
Yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of nothing new for humans to do. And as you mentioned before, when you're thinking about entertainment and the stories people wrote, those are the ideas they sort of came up with. And you see that but it doesn't bear much of anything for the project that you're performing here.
Yep.
But it's good that you mentioned this, because people are going to be curious, does that document have anything to say on that material? So glad you mentioned it. Now, there's another series here, the Revelation Dialogues. Maybe you could tell me about that, something I'm a bit unfamiliar with, and perhaps our listeners are as well. What are the Revelation Dialogues?
Well, this is a category of literature that is typically dated to the second half of the 2nd century and into the 3rd century. There's typically 3 different pieces of literature that belong in this category. The first is the Epistle of the Apostles. And this is a dialogue. It features a dialogue between the risen Jesus and his disciples, in which he opposes Gnostic teachings. So you've got Orthodox teachings in this. So we find Jesus talking about his full deity and bodily resurrection. But again, this is just this is fictitious. This is a response to Gnostic teachings. It doesn't really tell us anything about the historical Jesus or anything that would come from a primary source. Then you have what's called the Treatise of the Resurrection. Sometimes it's called the Letter to Reganos. And so Reganos is a man who is asking some questions. And then what this letter is or the Treatise on the Resurrection, this letter, it's a letter written by a Gnostic to Reganos answering his questions. So resurrection there refers to a spirit leaving the body and going to heaven. So it's a spiritual resurrection is disembodiment. It is a spiritual resurrection rather than a physical transformation, revivification, and transformation of a corpse. And then the third piece of literature within this category is called the Apocryphon of James. And this is, it presents Jesus, he's risen from the dead, but he hasn't yet ascended to heaven, even though that this narrates a discussion between Jesus, Peter, and James that is alleged to have taken place 18 months after his resurrection. And still, Jesus has been with them all this time. He hasn't ascended to heaven. So, this is, it is fictitious. There's really nothing in here that we would look at and think of as being worthwhile that goes back to the 1st century. So that's the resurrection or the Revelation
dialogues. Yeah. Let me ask you here. So when you're analyzing a document, as a historian, and you see the Revelation dialogues here, how as a historian what can help you differentiate between a work that is fictional and a work that is historical? So, for example, with the Epistle of the Apostles, as you mentioned, this is Orthodox teaching. But so how do you know that this is a work of fiction as opposed to history?
Okay, well, if it's dated to the latter part of the 2nd century, then we got to figure that's probably not a primary source that goes back to Jesus. But we do have primary sources. You've got the writings of Paul, we've got the Gospels, and several, at least at minimum, several of them are rooted in eyewitness testimony. So we can get back, and virtually all historians of Jesus will say that we can get back through the Gospels and through some help with Paul. We can get back to a number of sayings and acts of Jesus that, at least is going to give us an idea of the gist of some of the things that Jesus said and did. But this is just too late. And then we look at its setting and why it's written. It's written to address the Gnostic teachings of that time. And that form of Gnosticism, as far as we know, did not exist in the 1st century. So we just don't have reasons to think that this would be a primary source, whereas that's different from what we have with the New Testament literature.
Interesting. Yeah. Good. I know historians have all their methods. I know as well, looking at the writing style, for example, trying to date the manuscript evidence and all that is a part of that whole process. And it helps you determine, whether is this a primary source, or is this something that, comes 150 years later, and all of a sudden, the whole intent, it seems, changes. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move to an intriguing topic here within the non. So there's maybe debate here over the non-canonical Christian literature, the pseudo-Mark. The ending of Mark. Tell us about that and what scholars think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting you would point out, if we're calling this non-canonical, and yet pseudo-Mark, what many scholars refer to as pseudo-Mark, are the last 18 verses that we find in many of our Bibles today in the Gospel of Mark. This is chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. And in virtually all of your modern English translations, there are going to be brackets around these verses, and with a footnote at the bottom that says these verses are not found in the earliest and best manuscripts that we have. And it's rare to find a scholar today. There are few, but it's rare to find a New Testament scholar today who argues that these 18 verses appeared in the original Gospel of Mark. These verses are where it talks about, Jesus says, you'll go around and you'll pick up poisonous snakes, and you can drink poison and you'll be okay. The kind of stuff that they do in some of these small country churches in West Virginia up in the hills, where you have copperheads and water moccasins and things like that they're handling. And, sometimes they get bit and sometimes they die as a result. But most scholars don't think that this was written by Mark. Our two oldest manuscripts that contain Mark's endings don't include it. That would be the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, both of them written in 4th century. The vocabulary and style of these verses are not Markan, so the scholars will look at it and say, these are the kind of vocabulary terms that Mark uses everywhere throughout his gospel, but he uses some really unique terms here, a bunch of them, not just a few, but a number of them. And then the style just seems to be completely different in these 18 verses than in Mark's writing elsewhere. And also, I think one of the strongest reasons for thinking that these verses do not belong to the original Mark is they do not cohere well with verses 1 through 8. So let me just turn to them real quick, and we can look at that. So it's Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. So you got, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they could go and anoint him. Very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb at sunrise. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us?" Looking up, they observed that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a long white robe sitting on the right side. They were amazed and alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said to them. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has been resurrected. He is not here. See the place where they put him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There, you will see him there, just as he told you." So they went out and started running from the tomb, because trembling and astonishment overwhelmed them, and they said nothing to anyone, since they were afraid. That's 1 through 8. Now, follow me here in these next couple verses. Verse 9. Early on the first day of the week, after he had risen, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and reported to those who had been with him, as they were mourning and weeping. Now, isn't it strange here? It's almost like it starts over when it says on the first day of the week, after he'd risen, he appeared to Mary Magdalene. So there's no mention of the other Marys there, or the other Salome, and there's no mention of you've got the angel once again that's announcing to Mary, and only Mary apparently right here, that Jesus had been raised. So that's just strange. It just doesn't cohere well with the remainder of the verse. verses 1 through 8.
Yeah. So, when you look at the manuscript evidence, it's not there in the earliest manuscripts. It doesn't sound like something Mark would say.
That's right.
The story isn't coherent. There's sort of a restart. All the evidence sort of stacks up to say, this sounds like it was added in the text sometime later. But let me ask you this, Mike. So, how does Mark end, and what do scholars think? Is the true ending of Mark lost, or does it sort of end abruptly? There with the angel saying, "Go and tell others," and they left and were trembling.
Yeah. Well, there's basically three major positions. All right, we could say two major positions. All right, one is that Mark ends at verse 8. All right, and it's a strange ending because it says, "Out of fear and trembling, they fled from the tomb and said nothing to no one." And that's where it ends. So a lot of scholars think that that's where Mark intended for his gospel to end. And there's no mention of an appearance to Jesus. But it's really strange that it would end so abruptly and in such an awkward manner. Some rather skeptical scholars will say, see, you've got the empty tomb tradition and the appearance tradition. These are two separate. They come from two different camps because they said nothing to no one. But they don't take into consideration that earlier in Mark's gospel, chapter 1, verse 44, Jesus heals, I think it's a leper, and he says, go and say nothing to no one. Same kind of grammatical structure there, but show yourself to the high priest and what the Lord has done for you. What is being meant by that is by saying nothing to no one, it's saying don't stop along the way and tell anyone what's happened. Go directly to the high priest, to the priest in the temple. And I think what Mark is saying here, when the angel, it says they said nothing to no one, they didn't stop along the way to tell anyone. They went directly to the apostles. And besides, in chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus is predicting his resurrection, and he says, after I have raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see me. And then in verse 7 of chapter 16, the angel says, he has gone ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. It's referring to chapter 14, verse 28. Now, the skeptical scholars will say, yeah, but 14:28 was later added. How convenient, right? So I think it's more likely that the second position is either Mark did not intend for his gospel to end there. And that can be subdivided. Either the ending was lost or Mark was unable to complete it. Maybe he got sick and died, or he got thrown into prison and he wasn't able to complete it. I think that is more likely. And that is not the majority position, however. The majority of scholars think that it ended at chapter 16, verse 8. But the reasons they give for it are legion. It's like if there's 15 different scholars, there's 20 different explanations for why it ended that way. There is no consensus, not even anything approaching a consensus or a majority position on why Mark would have ended his gospel there. So
yeah, I think one explanation among the many, as you say, is that Mark wanted each Christian to share their own story about what it means to them that Jesus is resurrected,
And that's possible. I just find those unlikely. The longer ending that we see, verses 9 through 20, it's not exceptionally late. Irenaeus and Tatian around 170, and his Diatessaron, Irenaeus somewhere between 174 and 189. They both mentioned they're aware of the longer ending of Mark. So we know that it was composed sometime in the 2nd century, perhaps sometime prior to 170. It came about. And what's interesting here, Tom Wright, he makes an interesting observation or posits an interesting scenario here. He suggests the possibility that verses 9 through 20 was a separate account, perhaps from a lost gospel. And he makes this interesting observation. He says, these rather skeptical scholars, they try to detect traditions that are earlier than what we find in the Synoptic Gospels. Traditions that are earlier and contradict what we find in the Synoptic Gospels, like try to find something where Jesus didn't rise, he just ascended and was exalted in heaven, or something that's not bodily resurrection. That's what they're looking for. So they're very willing, and they're very willing to posit and accept something like an earlier version of Q and multiple recensions of this hypothetical source Q. I do believe that there was probably a Q source, but they tried to posit multiple and earlier versions of Q. An earlier version of the Gospel of Thomas that we have, an earlier version of the Gospel of Peter that we have, and then they like the secret Gospel of Mark. So it's like they're more than willing to embrace these kinds of things to find traditions that predate the Synoptic Gospels. But Wright goes on to say they never consider the possibility that verses 9 through 20 are the remains of a lost gospel, and or part of Mark's lost ending here. And they never tried to take this longer ending and try to reconstruct what Mark's lost ending might have looked like. Or he says, maybe Matthew, because Matthew's gospel follows Mark's resurrection narrative on a number of points. Maybe Matthew's gospel preserves some of the lost ending of Mark. Why aren't they trying to figure this stuff out? And it would seem that these things would be a lot more promising than looking at trying to identify earlier recensions of Q or earlier versions of the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, and things like this. And one wonders why they don't try to reconstruct Mark's lost ending from these things. And perhaps it's because they already know ahead of time that it wouldn't yield the results that they desire.
Yeah, interesting. Always fun to think about those verses in the Bible that maybe bracketed off. I mean, there are some other ones, or even the missing verses, depending upon which English translation you're reading. The closer you look, the more you realize, oh, hey, there's a history here of scribes working, and there are scholars hard at work trying to determine the most faithful representation of the autographa, the original writings. So great. Well, let's jump to a question from one of your followers, Chan. He asks, while the resurrection is the foundation on which the truth of Christianity rests, do you agree that as laymen, we need to be well-rounded on a wide range of topics? If so, why do you think so, and what topics do you think are the most important?
Well, I assume that Chan here is referring to laymen who are involved in Christian apologetics or interested in Christian apologetics. And I think he's certainly correct that the resurrection of Jesus is one of the most important, if not the most important thing to be looking at, because if Jesus was raised from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. So a lot rests on it, because if Jesus didn't rise, well, then Christianity is a false religion, and there's no sense in following Jesus if and devoting your life to him if Christianity is a false religion. But if you're really into apologetics, you want to learn apologetics, and you want to learn how to interact with others using evidences for Christianity and being able to answer objections to Christianity, well, then, you should be a little more well-rounded. You should study arguments for God's existence. So you're looking at some philosophical arguments. You're looking for some using some of the scientific data, which has been very friendly to suggesting that there's an intelligent designer who was responsible for the creation of the universe and guided it in such a way that it would be friendly for life, and that we could have intelligent life as we have it today. So, I think you do well if you study things like the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, and learn how become familiar That's a very difficult argument to address. You want to be able to address that. You want to, so there's philosophy in there, there's some science in there, and of course there's some historical things as well, especially when we come to the New Testament. The authorship of the Gospels and being able to talk about whether they're reliable and things like that. These are all important topics. So yeah, I would say not just the resurrection, but there are many other things to study, and it can be a lot of fun as well.
Getting some of the fundamentals down about the Gospels, like the A, B, C's, D's, and E's. You laugh. Right. Dr. Lacona's got a great lecture on his YouTube channel called The ABCs of the Gospels, or the ABCs, D's, and E's of the Gospels. You've got a couple of variations out there.
Yeah, the ABCs is on YouTube, and then I think I have the fuller version on Vimeo, my Vimeo channel. I don't have much on Vimeo, but that one's on there, yeah.
Yeah, great. So that's a great place to start for someone looking to become a little bit more well-rounded on gospel historical questions. So great question from Chan. Wonderful answer from Dr. Lacona. Thank you for that. And thanks for cluing us in on some of these other non-canonical Christian literature documents, looking at the Gospel of Judas, the Revelation dialogues, a few different documents there. And then the pseudo-mark. Always fun to think about that one, pseudo-mark. So good. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lacona. If you'd like to learn more about the work and ministry of Dr. Mike Lacona, you can go to risenjesus.com, where you can find authentic answers to genuine questions about the historical reliability of the Gospels and the resurrection of Jesus. It's there that you can find free resources like ebooks, PDFs, videos, loads of great material. Please go check out the website. If this program's been a blessing to you, would you consider becoming one of our monthly supporters? You can go to risenjesus.com/donate to begin your support today. Be sure to like Dr. Lacona on Facebook, follow him on Twitter, and subscribe to this channel, his YouTube channel, or the podcast that you may be listening to this program through, whether that's Apple Podcasts or the Google Play Store. This has been the Risen Jesus Podcast, a ministry of Dr. Mike Lacona.